Do you remember when supper wasn't about what you wanted? It was about what you had? Those meals that hill folk cooked from memory, instinct, and a bit of stubbornness? What happened to those hillbilly meals that once defined country life back in the day? Corn pone. Before there was cornbread in a pan or biscuits from a can, there was corn pone, the rough, no-nonsense cousin that built its reputation on smoke, ash, and patience. Every hill kitchen knew how to make it, and most didn't need a recipe. Just cornmeal, water, a pinch of salt, and a strong hand to pat it flat. Some folks cooked it in a skillet slicked with bacon grease. Others baked it right on the hearth beside the fire, the crust turning dark and smoky where the heat licked it. It was travel bread, work bread, survival bread. Men carried cold slices wrapped in newspaper to the fields, and kids soaked theirs in buttermilk to stretch a meal into a memory. Corn pone didn't rise, didn't crumble, didn't apologize. It didn't need soft edges or fancy butter. It just needed fire, hunger, and someone grateful enough to eat it warm. Squirrel stew. Now, here's a dish that'll separate the real country folks from the pretenders. Squirrel stew. Back in the backwoods, if a boy had good aim with a .22 or even just a steady slingshot, supper was practically guaranteed. Squirrels were everywhere, and a couple of them could turn into a hearty pot of stew when money was tight. Mama would clean and cut the meat, brown it up in a cast-iron skillet, then simmer it low with onions, carrots, and taters, sometimes adding a handful of canned tomatoes for good measure. The flavor was a little richer than chicken, with that wild edge that reminded you it came straight from the woods. The smell filled the cabin long before supper was served, and folks would crowd around the table, grateful for another warm meal that didn't cost a dime. In those days, nothing went to waste, and nobody saw it as strange. It was just part of life. Today, most people wouldn't dream of eating squirrel, but for the ones who grew up on it, that taste still lives somewhere deep in memory. Poke salad with cornbread. Now, here's one that truly separates the country folks from everyone else. Poke salad. If you weren't raised in the hills, you probably know pokeweed as that tall plant with dark purple berries. And you've probably been told it's poisonous. And you'd be right, unless you knew what you were doing. But the hillbilly mamas sure did. They'd gather the young, tender leaves in early spring, boil them 2 or 3 times to wash away the toxins, then fry them up in bacon grease till they were tender and smoky. The smell alone could stop you in your tracks. Served alongside a wedge of cornbread still hot from the skillet, poke salad tasted like the mountains waking up after winter. Outsiders would have never dreamed of touching it, but locals swore by it. Some even claimed it was good for cleaning the blood after a long winter of salt pork and potatoes. Kids complained about the bitter bite, but the grown folks cleaned their plates, proud of a meal pulled straight from the hillside. Fried corn with salt pork. Nothing said summer in the hills like fried corn crackling in a hot skillet. Families would cut the kernels straight off the cob, then milk the cob with the back of a knife to catch every drop of starchy sweetness. That milky corn went into a skillet already singing with chunks of salt pork, and within minutes, the whole kitchen smelled like heaven. Smoky, sweet, and buttery. The corn turned golden, sticky, and thick enough to hold its shape on a spoon. It didn't need anything fancy, maybe a sliced tomato from the garden, a wedge of cornbread, or a jar of homemade pickles on the side. Leather britches. If you ever stepped onto a country porch in late summer, you might have seen strings of green beans hanging in the sunlight, like laundry on the line. These weren't decorations. They were leather britches, one of the hillbilly kitchen's best-kept secrets for surviving winter. Families would snap fresh beans, thread them with a needle, and hang them to dry until they shriveled and turned leathery. Come cold weather, Mama would take down a string, simmer those beans for hours till they plumped up again, and season them with onions, salt, and a good spoonful of bacon grease if she had it to spare. The taste was earthy, smoky, and unlike anything you'd find in a grocery store, chewy and rich, with the kind of depth that comes only from patience and a wood stove fire. Some kids turned up their noses, but once a wedge of cornbread was crumbled in, those bowls emptied quick. Ramps and fried taters. When the frost melted and spring crept through the hills, folks knew ramp season had arrived. These wild onions were found high on the mountainsides, and you could smell them long before you saw them. Hillbillies would take baskets into the woods, dig them by hand, and bring them home like treasure. Fried up with sliced taters in a cast-iron skillet, ramps filled the house with a sharp, mouth-watering smell that lingered for days. Pa would fan the smoke from the stove while Mama laughed, saying that meant they were good ones this year. Served with a wedge of cornbread and maybe a jar of home-canned beans, ramps and fried taters were a celebration of spring, earthy, smoky, and alive. Cabbage and onions. Cabbage and onions didn't need an invitation. They showed up in every kitchen whether you liked it or not. The heads kept all winter in the cellar, and when the meat ran low, Mama would pull one out, slice it thick, and fry it down with onions till the edges turned brown and sweet. The smell filled the house. Part comfort, part warning that supper was gonna be simple. Sometimes she'd toss in diced potatoes, or a splash of vinegar if she was feeling fancy. The skillet hissed, the windows fogged, and everyone knew dinner was nearly ready. It wasn't glamorous, but there was something steady about it. Cornmeal mush. Cornmeal mush was what you made when payday was still 3 days away, and the cupboard looked like a tumbleweed rolled through it. Just cornmeal, water, salt, and hope cooked till it thickened enough to hold shape. Mama would pour it into a loaf pan, let it cool overnight, then slice it into golden slabs the next evening. Into the skillet they went, fried in bacon grease until the edges crisped and the middle stayed soft. Some drizzled it with sorghum, others drowned it in milk, but everyone cleaned their plate. It wasn't fancy. It was survival that tasted good. Kids thought of it as a treat until they grew old enough to realize it was a poor man's supper. Still, it had a quiet dignity, a reminder that you could make something out of almost nothing. Cornmeal crusted catfish. When the creek ran high and clear, supper came on a stringer. Catfish was the prize, not the kind you buy in a foam tray, but the kind caught with a cane pole and a little patience. Back home, Mama kept a coffee can of cornmeal waiting on the counter, seasoned with salt, pepper, and a secret pinch of cayenne. Every fillet went in dry and came out golden, sizzling in lard, till the crust crackled loud enough to make your stomach growl. The smell drifted down the holler, and neighbors would just happen to stop by. Served with hush puppies or cold slaw, catfish night was a celebration without ever calling it one. Fried apples and biscuits. Some nights, supper leaned more toward sweet than savory, and nobody complained. When the pantry was thin and the orchard was heavy, Mama reached for apples. She'd slice them thin, fry them in butter with a sprinkle of sugar and cinnamon, and let them caramelize till the whole kitchen smelled like pie without the pie crust. Then came the biscuits, hot, tall, and flaky, split open to catch the syrupy juice. The apples hissed and bubbled while kids circled like flies at a picnic. There wasn't any meat, but no one noticed. It was warm, sweet, and filling, the kind of supper that left you smiling instead of stuffed. Beans and greens with cornbread dumplings. If you grew up poor, you know that beans and greens can feed an army. Mama would soak the beans overnight, toss them in a pot with a ham hock, or maybe just wishful thinking, and let them simmer till the kitchen steamed. Then came the greens, turnip, mustard, or collards, whatever was growing behind the house. To stretch it further, she'd drop spoonfuls of cornbread batter right into the pot. They puffed up into golden dumplings that soaked the broth like little edible sponges of happiness. The smell wrapped around you like an old quilt. Pa called it stick-to-your-ribs food, though most kids just called it Tuesday. Johnny cakes with sorghum. Before sliced bread took over the world, supper often started with a bowl of cornmeal and a little nerve. Johnny cakes were simple, just cornmeal, salt, and water. But in the right hands, they turned into something close to art. Mama would fry them on a cast-iron skillet till the edges crisped and the middle stayed soft, then drizzle sorghum molasses across the top until it pooled in the cracks like dark gold. Some nights, that was supper all by itself. Just a plate of Johnny cakes, a cup of milk, and enough sweetness to make you forget you were broke. Kids ate them like pancakes. Pa used them to scoop up beans, and Mama just smiled, knowing she'd fed everyone without leaving the house. The smell of those cakes hitting the skillet could turn an empty kitchen into a home. Dandelion greens with vinegar. Only a hillbilly could walk through a yard full of weeds and see supper. When spring rolled in, folks grabbed buckets and pocket knives and went hunting, not for deer, but for dandelions. They'd pick the young, tender leaves before the blooms opened, boil them once to soften the bite, then fry them with bacon grease or just a splash of oil. A dash of vinegar gave them a tang sharp enough to make you blink. Served with cornbread, it was poor folks' salad before anyone started charging $12 for one. Mamas called it a spring tonic, swearing it cleaned out your blood after winter's salt pork diet. The kids didn't love it, but they ate it because Mama said so. Fish head soup. Fish head soup wasn't a meal for the faint of heart or the picky eater. In those hill kitchens, nothing went to waste, especially not the best parts of a good catch. The heads, bones, and scraps went into the pot with onions, potatoes, and a few garden herbs, bubbling away until the broth turned rich and deep. Kids would peek into the pot and swear the fish was staring back at them, but they'd still eat every drop once the smell hit the air. It was earthy, briny, and stronger than it had any right to be. Pa used to say it'd put backbone in a man, and maybe he was right. It certainly kept him quiet till bedtime. Sweet potato biscuits. When the sweet potatoes came in from the garden, Mama worked them into everything: pies, casseroles, and especially biscuits. She'd mash the cooked potatoes right into the dough, turning those biscuits a soft golden color that glowed like autumn itself. They baked up tender, faintly sweet, and good enough to eat plain, though nobody ever did. Butter, sorghum, or apple butter usually made their way to the table too, because hill folks never wasted an excuse for sweetness. If there were leftovers, a rare event, they'd get sliced and fried up for breakfast the next morning alongside eggs and fatback. Pickled beans and corn. Now, here's a dish that proves hillbilly kitchens were never short on cleverness. Pickling wasn't just for cucumbers. Beans and corn got their turn too. Families would layer them in crocks with salt and water and let them ferment till the tang could wake you from a nap. When the jar was finally opened, the smell hit first, sharp, sour, and somehow inviting. A bowl of pickled beans and corn with a hunk of cornbread was often supper, especially when meat was scarce. It snapped between your teeth, salty and bright, like summer trapped in vinegar. Kids called it sour stuff, but Pa called it good eatin', and that was that. Hominy with fried onions. Hominy was proof that mountain folks could turn plain corn into a miracle of patience and chemistry. You started with dried kernels, soaked them in lye water until they swelled like little white marbles, and prayed you didn't mix too strong. Otherwise, you'd have soap instead of supper. Once the husk slipped free, you rinsed it again until your hands were pruny, then poured it into a skillet with a chunk of bacon grease and a handful of chopped onions. It was one of those suppers that didn't need explaining. It was what you had. Skillet cabbage and potatoes. If you grew up in the mountains, you could tell what was for supper the second you smelled cabbage hitting a hot skillet. That hiss and sizzle was a soundtrack all its own, like rain on a tin roof, but saltier. Cabbage and potatoes were the backbone of mountain cooking, humble, stubborn, and always hanging around in the root cellar like old relatives who never went home. You'd slice the cabbage thin, dice the potatoes, toss them with onions, and let everything fry until it softened and browned at the edges. Some cooks added a splash of vinegar for bite. Others tossed in a few pieces of bacon when they could afford it. When that skillet hit the table with a side of cornbread, nobody complained. It was honest food that filled the belly and fogged up the windows on a cold night. Egg and onion gravy. Egg and onion gravy was the kind of meal that made you believe in culinary magic, turning a couple of eggs and an onion into something that could hush a hungry household. It started with a skillet and a cook who knew what she was doing. The onions went in first, sizzling in bacon grease until they turned the color of good varnish, sweet and smoky all at once. Then came the eggs, beaten with a splash of milk and a spoon of flour to thicken everything into a silky golden gravy. It wasn't fancy, but the way it poured over biscuits or mashed potatoes made it feel like a Sunday blessing. Rabbit stew. Rabbit stew was what folks called chicken of the hollow, though most kids knew better. It didn't taste quite like chicken, and it sure didn't come from the store. In the 50s Appalachian hills, rabbits were raised in hutches out back or snared in the woods with traps fashioned from baling wire and hope. When one made its way to the kitchen, it meant you were eating well that night. The meat was lean and tender, simmered low and slow with onions, carrots, and potatoes until the whole cabin smelled like Sunday dinner, even if it was Wednesday. Chowchow over pinto beans. Chowchow wasn't just a relish in the Appalachian hills. It was a kind of currency. Every August, when the garden was giving its last gasp, mountain women stood in their kitchens with sweat on their brows and vinegar in the air, chopping cabbage, green tomatoes, peppers, and onions until the counters looked like a confetti parade. It was loud, messy work, but they knew what they were doing. They were bottling the only taste of summer that would make it through January. When snow covered the porch steps and the woodpile was running low, those jars glowed like jewels on the shelf. You'd pull one down, pop the lid, and the smell alone could wake a sleepy pot of beans back to life. Peanut butter and syrup sandwiches. Now, a hillbilly supper didn't always need a stove. Sometimes all you needed was a jar of peanut butter, a jug of cane syrup, and a good strong spoon. Folks around here mixed them together till it turned shiny and smooth, like caramel for people who couldn't afford caramel. You'd slap that mess between two pieces of bread, maybe a biscuit if you had one left from breakfast, and call it supper. It glued your mouth shut quicker than a Baptist preacher's handshake, but it'd hold you till morning. Kids licked it off their fingers, mamas didn't fuss much, and nobody complained because it beat going hungry. Some added a slice of banana if they were feeling fancy. Others just scraped the jar clean and hoped payday came before the syrup ran out. The stuff would drip down your wrists, and you'd swear you'd never eat it again, right up until the next night when you made another one. Succotash with cornbread. Succotash wasn't born out of fancy recipes. It was born out of gardens that wouldn't quit. When the corn came in faster than you could eat it, and the beans kept climbing the fence, you threw them together in one pot and hoped the stove didn't quit halfway through. The smell was pure summer, sweet corn, green beans, and a whisper of smoke from the bacon grease that made everything taste like home. The beans went soft, the corn stayed a little crisp, and by the time you stirred it down, it looked humble as could be, just a bubbling skillet of gold and green. That's when the cornbread showed up, hot from the pan, split open with steam pouring out. Pickled beets and eggs. There was always one jar in the pantry that looked like it came from another world, glowing red, sitting proud between the beans and the chowchow. That was the pickled beets and eggs. You could spot 'em a mile away. Eggs turned the color of sunrise after soaking for days in beet juice and vinegar. The brine had a bite to it that'd make your jaw tingle, and it smelled sharp enough to wake the dog. Hill folks loved those jars because they lasted forever, and brightened a winter table when everything else was brown or gray. When the lid came off, that vinegar hissed, and you knew supper was about to have a little attitude. The eggs sliced clean and pretty, the beets sweet and earthy, simple food that somehow felt like celebration. Sorghum syrup and biscuits. When the sorghum mill fired up in the fall, the whole holler smelled like burnt sugar and smoke. Mules walked the press in slow circles, while the juice ran into steaming pans, turning thicker and darker with every stir of the paddle. By the time it was done, you had syrup that looked like liquid copper and stuck to everything it touched. Folks filled mason jars and coffee cans, knowing that one good run could sweeten a whole winter. Supper on sorghum nights was simple: a pan of biscuits pulled from the oven, split open, and drowned in syrup so thick it moved slow as honey in January. Irish potato soup. There wasn't a winter that didn't see a pot of potato soup simmering on somebody's stove. Potatoes were cheap, steady, and hard to ruin, which made them perfect for a hillbilly kitchen. You'd slice them thin, toss them in a pot with onions, water, and a splash of milk if the cow was still giving. The trick was to let it cook low and long, till the broth went cloudy and the taters started melting into it. The smell was the kind that could pull a person out of bed before dawn. The old hillbilly suppers weren't written down in books or passed around at potlucks. They were learned by watching somebody's mama stir a pot till the steam fogged her glasses. None of it looked like much, but it all carried the same promise: a full belly, a warm house, and another day made it through. These weren't meals built for show. They were built for staying alive with a little pride left over. The skillet, the smoke, the scrape of a spoon against tin, that was the soundtrack of the hills. Folks might chase fancy flavors now, but those of us who grew up on the smell of bacon grease and wood smoke know better. Supper didn't need to impress anyone, it just needed to taste like home.